Welcome to the fourth in our series of lectures on computer hardware. In this one, we'll explore an analogy to describe how a computer system works as material is transferred between primary storage and secondary storage. To begin, why don't we consider appropriate definitions for these two things? Primary storage is a term that refers to what we might consider the workbench, so to speak, of our computer. It is where processing takes place. Instructions are loaded into this area as data is updated, and this is where it is held until such time as the user is ready to store it away. Secondary storage would be comparable to a storage building or a cabinet. This is where data is semi-permanently held until it's needed again. Note the term semi-permanent. It suggests that the information is held until such time as the user decides to move it somewhere else or delete it permanently. Now, whereas this description may give us some idea of how these two areas work, we really need to look at more information about the two. Here we have two columns with headings primary storage and secondary storage. Let's just compare the two. First, let's point out that those terms simply suggest classifications, primary and secondary. To go a step further, we can link common forms of hardware or physical devices to the two classifications. Primary storage is usually associated with the random access memory of the computer, or RAM. Secondary storage is often a hard disk drive or a flash drive or a DVD, devices that we examined in an earlier lecture. Now let's look at some of the differences between these two broad classifications. RAM is volatile. That means it requires power, and the loss of that power causes all data held there to vanish. Disk drives are semi-permanent, as we've already mentioned. RAM is very high speed. This is a completely electronic object that transmits data as fast as it will go over whatever medium is being used. Of course, its speed is determined in part by that medium. However, disk drives are usually mechanical devices with disks that spin and heads that move around the tracks. These are the magnetic devices that we talked about previously, although there is a brand new breed of disk drive, the solid-state drive, that is quickly gaining popularity. These are also electronic and suffer from the same cost issues as RAM. However, they're gradually dropping in price and increasing in capacity so that one day soon, hopefully, they may be almost as economical as the magnetic disk. RAM has a very limited capacity when compared to the magnetic disk drives. You might have 8 billion bytes of available RAM on your computer, which is quite a bit, but today there are magnetic disk drives with several trillion bytes of capacity. That RAM is expensive when compared to the magnetic disk. So there you have a comparison between primary and secondary storage. Now, how can we explain the way all this works? I have an analogy I like to use comparing the computer operation to the kitchen operation. So let's look at it. Here we have a kitchen. Notice that our kitchen also has some things that correspond to primary and secondary storage. Just like the computer, we must have some place, identified as secondary storage, to store our material both raw and prepared. That might be your pantry or your refrigerator. Our kitchen also has an area that is used to prepare the food that we're identifying as primary storage. That might be the kitchen counter or the table. After all, we don't stand in a pantry to cook, now do we? So how do we use the kitchen? First, we move the raw material from storage to our workspace. There we will prepare the meal, or at least a dish. Now, after the dish is prepared, we just don't leave it sitting out there, do we? We might make somebody sick if we do that. So we will move the prepared dish back to storage until we're ready to serve. That would probably be the refrigerator. Now, does that sound like a reasonable, albeit simple, description of how a kitchen works? Now let's examine how a computer works. Well, so far it looks a lot like a kitchen. It has primary storage and secondary storage. However, if we draw a diagram depicting a disk drive, it might look more like this. It is still where the material is permanently stored, just like the kitchen. And when we're talking about computers, we usually say processing rather than preparing. In our computer, that secondary storage area is usually a disk drive or something of that nature. And of course, primary storage is RAM, not a tabletop. There is still movement between the two areas, just like in the kitchen. However, in a computer, we don't move it, we copy it. That means if the power goes off, killing that volatile RAM, we don't lose all our data, because we still have a copy on the disk drive. We only risk losing the changes that we made, and that is why we save frequently as we work. Of course, when we're through processing, we move the processed data back. Or rather, we copy the processed data. That's why when we make those frequent saves, we are still able to work on our job until we actually tell the software to close the document. So there you go. Does the analogy work? Well, it's my analogy, and I'm going to say it does. There you have a short lecture on how a computer works. See you in the next lecture.